Camera number 156 of 365 is the Nikon F70, sometimes known as the N70. It's a camera that requires batteries to operate all of its functions, which are all electronic, but you have quite a variety of options open to you. But let's just put the batteries in first of all, which we do by turning the camera on the bottom, on its back rather, and opening the battery compartment. Reveals two 123 batteries, and the orientation is shown for us on the base of the door there, which we then close. As is typical of these cameras of this age, the little lip that secures the battery compartment can sometimes break, so you want to be careful with that. While we're on the back, we just have a tripod mount. So then, looking at the front of the camera, we have a lens release button, and I fitted probably one of my favourite autofocus lenses, the Nikon 28 to 85mm 3.5 to 4.5. Not the fastest, but quite a substantial lens, quite a heavy lens, which when combined with the camera, you certainly know you've got the camera. But it's worth carrying around, I think. While we're on the subject of the lens, the Nikon mount there, most autofocus lenses with an aperture ring can be used. The camera can use AI lenses, but the camera has to be placed in manual mode, where you then set the shutter and aperture yourself. So, meanwhile, turning back our attention to the front of the camera, we have a lever that allows us to choose autofocus or manual focus, and then we have a little cover that allows us to put a electronic remote control. We have a little light that will light up when we place our camera in timer mode, and then our shutter actuation button. So let's just put the lens back on the camera. There we go. And it's turning to the top plate of the camera that can cause divisions among Nikonites. It's the dreaded or infamous or famous fan system that the camera uses. I suppose really, if you think about it, looking at the history of the camera, or cameras in general at this particular time when this camera was released, camera manufacturers were squeezing so many different functions into the camera. It was becoming an increasing problem of how you make it accessible to the user. So Nikon at that particular time chose never to repeat this, interestingly enough. So I think the feedback was negative, but they tried a system whereby you could access the functions using a series of the command dial and buttons. And so let's just turn the camera on by sliding our switch. And essentially what we do to choose any of the functions of the camera, we use the function button and command dial that will allow us to go around the fan. And then once we've selected our particular function that we want to change, we then release the function button, press the set button, and then we can choose whatever functions within that. So if I've read it correctly, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, so let's just press the function button, and you'll notice it's on ISO on the bottom there. So now we've got ISO function available, we now can set it by pressing the set button and rotating the command dial. So now we can choose our film speed. So if we now go back to the function button and rotate it, we now have another ability or functionality, if you like, where we can choose our release mode. We can choose single release, multiple release low, multiple release high, single release low. Quite sure what that's all about, but there you go. So then we go back to the function. We now move into our manual focus with electronic rangefinder. So although we can change the focus mode here, we can employ the camera's focus mode assist with that function. And then we can choose our program mode. Now we have a choice of program. Then we can go to the usual program: shutter priority, aperture priority, manual. And then go back to function. We now choose our focus area, matrix metering, central focus metering, central metering, or spot metering. And then going across again, we now can choose our flash mode, which has a number of functions: red eye, rear curtain, etc. Going to the next one, we have exposure compensation, and then finally a bracketing, auto exposure bracketing set. So it does seem very complicated, but going back to that time period, how else do you perhaps help people to benefit from all the functions? Well, we now know, obviously they changed that system to make it a little bit easier, but certainly there are the basics for many of our modern cameras now. We choose a menu system. So that runs through the various systems of the different options for the camera. If we press PS on the right hand side here, that takes us back to, if you like, a factory reset. So that's now program mode. And if we just put our lens on and lock it, we now have program mode. We can shift that vary program, if you like, and now we can change the various combinations of aperture and shutter with program mode. There we go. Okay, the blue button, that's a little window here for our focus. Again, we can choose our focus mode. So they're quick release buttons, if you like, or quick access buttons. Now the two buttons on the left here probably could cause a lot more confusion than maybe any other thing, in that what do you use them for? Well, basically, if I'm reading the camera manual correctly, in the F70 you have 4 banks where you can store various options that you've set up for your camera and quickly recall them. And if I'm right in the way that it works, we set our camera up. So let's, for example, let's set the camera in manual mode. So we press function, rotate it around, now set P, and we'll go to manual mode, aperture priority. Let's go aperture priority. And then we can now store various other functions. So let's just move back and choose our focus mode. Our focus area, let's go for spot metering. And then once we've set the camera up the way we like it, we can basically press in, and we can choose from one of 4 numbers. 0 is a factory default, if you like, so you generally would leave that, so we actually have 3 banks. So if I set it as number 1, the camera now stores those settings that I've set up. So if I now move, go back to our mode here, and let's change that to shutter priority. And now if I press in again and set that up as number 2, so now if I want to recall those settings, I simply pen and rotate the dial to the number I've set. So I set it to 1, that was aperture priority. If we set it to 2, that was shutter priority. So I thought it's interesting that there's so many features, and really, perhaps, I don't know whether this is the first camera, I don't have sufficient knowledge on that, but certainly from my understanding, this camera laid the basis for a lot of what we now have available through various menus in our liquid crystal displays on the back of our cameras. And I find that quite interesting. But I'm sure if that's not the case, somebody else will correct me there. We do have other modes here, creative modes, which I've not touched on. And the way we get to those is by pressing the P button. And we rotate the dial to PS, or P rather. No, it's PS, beg your pardon. Now with it pressed in, we can now cycle through. We have portrait mode, we have infinity focus, or it's actually hyperfocal focus here. We also have landscape, macro, sports mode. Moving on to the next one, we have silhouette program, and then we have nighttime. Oops, that's the wrong button. Nighttime, and then sports mode with a little bit of blur. So there truly is so many features crammed in to this camera. The back is exchangeable. This particular one is the date imprinting one, but it can be fitted. If we can take the back off. There we go, and we can exchange that. And then while we're here, you also notice a button to have panorama mode, and you'll see what it does. It provides us with a blind, so it shields off some of the film and gives us a panoramic viewpoint. There we go. So let's just put that back on. There we go, back on. And there's the cover for the battery compartment. So there we go. There is camera number 156 of 365.